In her book, Girl on Girl, How Pop Culture Turned a Generation of Women Against Themselves, London-based Atlantic staff writer Sophie Gilbert offers her answer to the question, what happened to feminism in the 21st century? This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, she examines the pop culture of the late 1990s and early 2000s and highlights its impact on women and the feminist movement. During this hour-long episode, she speaks with Jennifer Pozner, author and founder of Women in Media and News, an education and advocacy group that works to increase women's presence and power in the public debate.
Sophie, I am so glad to be here today with you to talk about your eye-opening, fascinating look at pop culture and its devastating and manipulative, insidious impact on millennial women. If it's okay with you, I would love to start by reading a quote from your book.
I would love that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, all right. Couple quotes, actually. Let's see. There was a moment at the beginning of the 21st century when feminism felt just as nebulous and inert, squashed by a cultural explosion of jokey extremity and technicolor objectification. This was the environment that millennial women were raised in. It informed how we felt about ourselves, how we saw each other, and what we understood women as a collective to be capable of. I wanted to understand how a generation of young women came to believe that sex was our currency, our objectification was empowering, and we were a joke. Why were we so easily persuaded of our own inadequacy? Who was setting the agenda? Why, for decades and even now, has virtually every cultural product been so insistently oriented around male desire and male pleasure? And then I'm going to jump to one last part of that same thought from later in the book. I have, by the way, Post-its throughout this entire book. There's so much to underline and underscore. The cultural landscape we inhabit shapes more than just fantasy. It also contours the ways in which we think, write, dream, and create. And as a feminist media critic who's been working in this space since the mid-90s, actually as a student in the early 90s even, I couldn't agree more about the role that media play in our entire formation of our worldviews, the ways that we not only see ourselves, but see what we imagine is possible for ourselves, for others, how we conceptualize the very structures of society. So I wanted to start with those quotes because I think you lay out really well why you wanted to write this book. I'd love you to open by talking a little bit about what propelled you to write Girl on Girl, and what is your overall thesis?
Well, before even that, I wanted to say how happy I am to talk to you too, because I've been a fan of your work for so long, and I think I interviewed you long ago, and I drew on your book about reality television so much when I was trying to sort of frame my thinking for this book. So it's amazing to be in conversation with you today. But the project of Girl on Girl, I think it really started to coalesce in my mind in 2022 after Roe was overturned. And it was this moment when we had over the last few years very just bad times for women in life, in governance, in public. I mean, obviously, Hillary Clinton lost the election to Donald Trump in 2016. We had the Me Too movement and this real outpouring of stories about abuse and harassment in a way that made it clear that things were not going great for women at work. And then we had COVID, which I think made clear that things were not going great for women at home either. And it just seemed this point of almost like a point of clarity for me. And there were people who were doing amazing work thinking about the politics of what had happened, but it made sense to me to look back at the culture. And I think I started the book in 1999 because it was the year I turned 16, and it seemed kind of a crucial year, because at that age I was thinking so much about womanhood and about the future. We were sort of on the cusp of this new millennium, and there was this like real techno-utopian vibe where everything seemed full of potential. But I also remember just all these messages in media telling me what my worth was as a teenage girl, what the worth of all women was. I think things like Britney Spears on the cover of Rolling Stone, wearing a pink and black bra, clutching a Teletubby doll when she was, I think, a teenager herself. It was this very eroticized photo. And then she's clutching a Teletubby. So that was one thing. I think the movie American Beauty also came out in 1999. That's a movie that was highly lauded. It won 5 Oscars, but it is essentially about a middle-aged man's sexual fixation on his teenage daughter's best friend. And it has all these like aestheticized scenes that really eroticize the character, Minu Suvari's character, the best friend, that in ways that almost seem to license like the sexual fixation on this girl. And also at the end of the year, the Abercrombie and Fitch catalogue, which is targeting, I think, 13 to 18-year-olds at the time, had an interview with the porn star Jenna Jameson. And there were just all these signals, I think, in the media at the time that we as girls and as women should be thinking about the idea that sex was power, and that sexual power was thrilling for us. It would be our currency in this new millennium, and it would be everything we should aspire to and everything we should try to claim for ourselves. And so I wanted to go back with the book to sort of pick apart more of the history, more of the cultural history, and see if I could figure out where this moment came from, why it happened, and then in the later chapters, what we all took away from it.
That is one of the things that you do so well in this book, is really sort of chart the course. Almost, it's funny, one of the things that became so popular as a sort of a sub-genre of thing that we do on the internet in the aughts, and especially the teens, was TV recaps, like recap forums for TV, and eventually it became recap forums for movies and music and all that. But I almost felt when I was reading this book, and I read every page, that it was like a recap forum for 3 decades of culture, right? Because you chart what representations of women were doing to us and with us and for us or against us in music, in film, in the change from Riot Girl to Spice Girl, in the change from rom-coms to schlocky and often misogynist bromance movies, from sort of erotica to torture porn, from a progressive moment of third wave inclusive feminism to cultural backlash, as well as political backlash. And I'm fascinated by what you in the book. I was fascinated by what you said about 99, and I am again here because it's not just that there were so many sort of explosive moments of telling and sort of prescient misogyny that were going on in that year. You just said you were 16 in 99, right? So that was the year after, I'm pretty sure that was the year after Time magazine did a whole cover story that framed as a question, but really it was the answer they wanted us to take away. Is feminism dead? Did you come across that cover in your research?
I did. I read it. It was hard to find, I think, because it was archived, but I have a friend who worked at Time at the time, and she sent me a PDF. But what a story.
Yeah, so one of the things that people don't remember, even the people who remember that story sort of vaguely, it was, I wrote about it at the time. I wrote about it when you were 16. So let me go back. One of the things that's so exciting to me about this book is that you are, and I think fair to say, elder millennial, right?
Very fair, yes. Elder millennial.
Right. So you're an elder millennial. I'm a younger Gen X. So we're not actually very far apart in age, but the few years that we are apart, were incredibly formative
Yeah.
because you were a teenager at the
Yeah.
time. And so, in 99, I had just moved to New York to take over as the head of the head of the women's desk at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, which at that time was the only media watch organization in America.
Wow.
Was looking at media and news media and how sort of accuracy and representation and all of that. But before that, from 96, 97 or so, I had the first feminist media criticism column in a newspaper in the country. I couldn't get anyone, it was shouting into a void to get any corporate outlets to pay any attention to this.
Yeah.
So there was a newspaper called Sojourner, the Women's Forum, and I started writing about pop culture as well as news and women and people of color and representation issues for them in a Media Watch column. And so in 99, I had already written about so many of the things that you cover in this book because I was in my early 20s to mid 20s while you were a teenager, right? So I'm fascinated by the fact that, I'd written this story about Time trying to kill feminism by putting 3 archival real pictures in sad black and white, making it seem like, from a woman from Suffrage, and I think it was Betty Friedan, and then Gloria
Ally
Steinem.
McBeal, I think, was one of them.
Yeah, and they were all black and white, and then it was Ally McBeal, a character, not even Callista Flockhart, the actress, right? McBeal, the character, in full color, and the big stark words, "Is feminism dead?" And they didn't talk to actual feminists. They talked to anti-feminists, and they talked to some people who considered themselves sort of post-feminist, and their premise was that we are in a post-feminist age, and feminism did its part. Feminism was great back in the day, in the 70s, but now it was no longer necessary because we're in this post-feminist age. And you talk a lot about post-feminism in the book. And I am fascinated to know exactly what you think post-feminism is, because in my mind and in my writing in the past, post-feminism, it started out as a sort of similar to sort of a part of the postmodernism project, but very quickly became synonymous with anti-feminism dressed up as consumerism.
Yeah.
Anti-feminism dressed up as conservatism dressed up as feminism. What do you think post-feminism is? Because it comes up a lot in your book, and what's the agenda behind it?
So I should say, when I started planning the book, I knew I wanted to focus on the 2000s, and I initially thought, a 21st century cultural history book would be the frame, but there was so much that happened in the 90s that was just so crucial to this period in so many ways. I mean, one thing was the AIDS crisis, which we can talk about later, and the impact that had on culture, but the transition from third wave feminism at the beginning of the 90s, and the sort of riot girl energy and the activist energy that was really being felt in music and in zines, and it was such a sort of exciting, trying its best to be inclusive, like a real energetic moment. And things like Anita Hill's testimony at Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearings. I mean, the year of the woman in 1992, like, it really felt like all this progress was being made, and then it just got flattened by post-feminism. And people have asked me, while I'm talking about the book, people have asked me, explain post-feminism, and it's very hard to do because it didn't really have a standard bearer or a figurehead. It wasn't the kind of movement that people wrote, I think, ideologies about, or anyone had a kind of manifesto for post-feminism. What I think about it more as now, it was like a mechanism to sell things, I think. And it was a mechanism that was used mostly in the media as a way to discuss how much women had already achieved, and how feminism wasn't deemed to be necessary anymore because, more and more women were in the workplace, and women had more financial power. And I think it was part of a backlash against feminism that sort of was sneakily pretending to be something else. And it espoused the idea that women were free now to do whatever they want. They could wear whatever they wanted. They could be as sexy as they wanted. They could, and go out and shop, basically, was a lot of the impetus behind it. And I think it was captured so well by the Spice Girls, who took this slogan that the Riot Girl movement had been using, girl power, which was very intentionally activist and had like real meaning behind it. It was sort of campaigning for more power for girls and women in the punk scene and its shows, and freedom from sexual assault and freedom from harassment, like real, it really had an agenda. But the way that the Spice Girls reclaimed it, suddenly girl power, it was sort of much more celebratory, right? Like it didn't stand for anything. It didn't want to change anything. It wasn't fighting for any particular thing it wanted to achieve. It was just, it was like this kind of empty, very cheerful, and I love the Spice Girls and I still do, but they really seemed to embody what was happening to women in media over the course of the 90s. And then I think because the Spice Girls were so good at selling things, and I think they had something like $500 million worth of marketing and commercial deals in their first year and a half as a band. And I mean, someone told me on tour they had a Spice Girls toaster. I've heard all kinds of like weird Spice Girls commercial things that people owned during this decade, but they were so brilliant at selling products. And this was also around the time that corporations realized that teenage girls had a lot of spending power because they had babysitting money and they didn't have mortgages, and they were actually this like pretty good demographic if you're trying to sell your product. And that, I think, really ushered in what happened in the 2000s and the sort of the shooing away of the more powerful, more activist, more forceful women in rock music, and the real commercial media focus on these sexualized, like more passive, more pliant teenagers.
Yeah, you know, a lot of, I don't know if it's necessarily fully explicit in Girl on Girl, but one of the undertones and sort of themes that I took away from it is this very, that so much of what has afflicted representations of women in culture and even in politics over the last 30 plus years is a direct result of corporate media, of capitalist and commercialized agendas that often present a shiny gloss over a sinister underbelly. And to some degree, maybe I'm reading that in because that's been part of the thesis of a lot of my work, media critic, but it feels like a lot of what you've talked about, whether it's Terry Richardson and increasingly violent and sexually exploitive and pedophilic fashion and beauty imagery, or product placement in reality TV, in the Real Housewives franchises, whether it's torture porn images, so much of what you talked about is directly linked to the profit motives behind getting women to both buy things and to see themselves as the products being not only sold to, but the products being sold.
No, I mean, that's absolutely right. And especially in reality television, I think money was behind all of it, absolutely everything. But even, I mean, to start even earlier, there was this real shift in hip hop, I think, in the early 90s, where hip hop had arisen as a form of protest music. It was very powerful. It spoke out about the conditions that musicians were living under. And it was sort of charged in these really interesting and potent ways. But the minute that it became commercially successful and people saw how commercially successful it could be, they weren't comfortable with it being as insurgent as it was, and for all the things it was demanding. And so there's a theory among certain music critics and historians that this music that was very much about fight the power was suddenly redirected in its outrage from sources of power toward women. And that is why the theory goes that hip hop became so much more misogynistic in the early 90s, and was because women were sort of a safe place for people to vent their rage. So you see these instances really throughout the book, I think, and that's a really good way of putting it. But in reality television, certainly, I mean, reality began because people saw how cheap it was. And when the writers' strikes happened and people had space to fill on the networks, they realized that you could make these shows that didn't have actors, didn't have makeup, didn't have writers, that really sort of relied on much scrappier talent. And once once everyone caught on to the idea of how cheap it could be to make these kinds of shows, there was really, like, as you capture in your book, there was such a race to the bottom. Like the idea that networks would compete with each other to find the most outrageous premise, right? Like the most transgressive premise, the thing that would really provoke eyeballs and get people to watch. And that was what I think colored so much of the misogyny in early reality television. But that's much more your field, so I'm so curious to know, like, if you agree on that front.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Both in terms of what you were saying about hip hop, you're very much on the right path with that. One thing that always stuck in my mind, there's a filmmaker, Byron Hurt, who did a documentary years ago, maybe 20 years ago, I don't remember the exact year, but it was called Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, and he was a hip hop fan, but he was also working in programs trying to sort of dismantle male violence against women. And so he decided, and he's a Black man, and he decided to sort of investigate his own hip hop fandom, but also in particular the messaging in hip hop and the shift in hip hop from exactly what you said, the early origins of fighting power and structural sort of condemnation of structural abuses and white supremacy in America. And one of the things that he explores is not just misogyny in which he does, but he also, I don't remember who he interviewed, but he interviewed somebody who had worked for some of the very early hip hop musicians and labels. And this person said basically that as soon as hip hop became something that the music industry itself started signing signing artists who had been more conscious artists, once they became really interested in commercializing hip hop from the studio and industry side, immediately the music itself started to become more of the gangster music and more of the misogynist music.
Yeah.
It was this instant. Byron Hurt and his interviewees who were in that movement at the time said it was literally day and night. Corporate ownership shifted the entire content and focus of that music. When it comes to reality TV, the question you asked, I 100% agree with you. And it wasn't even just the writers' strikes, right? Reality TV, as you really interestingly, I think you, in your chapter on reality TV, you talk about sort of the rudimentary sort of first bits of reality TV before people think of the genre. You talk about sort of a real actual documentary style reality show on public broadcasting. You talk about a young woman who sort of broadcasts her life from her college dorm every day. But when most people think of reality TV, they think of reality TV from the year 2000 on, because that's the year Who Wants to Marry a Multimillionaire, which you talk about and which I talked about in Reality Bites Back, came on the air. It's also the year Survivor came on the air. And what you said about sort of the making money aspect of it, my premise has always been from the year 2000 on that reality TV would, it's not premise, it's just fact, it would not exist without product placement. Mark Burnett, who created Survivor and then also created Celebrity Apprentice with Donald Trump, he could not get Survivor picked up anywhere. And then all the networks said no. And then he went back, lined up just a ton of millions of dollars worth of product placement. And then CBS is like, oh, wait, we can do what Sophie said. We don't have to pay union wages to actors and boom mic operators. We can just pay like nothing to the main cast and ununionized work behind the scenes. Plus we get hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars in product placement for episodes before they even go on the air. So we don't have to charge the same amount for commercials that we have to do for our scripted shows because we've already made our money, great, sign me up. So, and it didn't have to be misogynist. The misogyny that you note and that I noted in reality TV, it could have been so different. If people like the people you talk about, Mike Darnell, Mike Fleiss, if they at Fox and ABC had a different idea of what drama meant, of what women and men were about, if they were more sort of egalitarian or even just less hateful in their personal approaches, in their personal ideology, you could imagine that there would have been different formative shows than women sort of parading themselves in a beauty pageant to marry some stranger who had a history of domestic violence on Who Wants to Marry a Multimillionaire, or sort of the annual romantic cattle call of The Bachelor, and the cut women up and open them up on the Swan and Extreme Makeover, which we've both written about, and you, I think, really well remind people just how brutal and just how vicious the physical abuse that women took on some of those, especially plastic surgery shows, but also just brutal, the emotional abuse. You write very well about how humiliation was key in reality TV, and almost like a ritual sacrifice of self-esteem, a ritual sacrifice of women's sense of ambition, a ritual sacrifice of women's right to be anything other than a projection of what men might want from them, and the idea that women shouldn't aspire to anything other than being chosen by any guy. Basically, doesn't have to be a good guy. So I think you remind people to think more critically and deeply about the things that we might have a lot of nostalgia for these days. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role nostalgia plays, and if part of what you wrote this book to do was to remove those sort of nostalgic goggles from folks who, like, it's one thing to be a feminist media critic and feel in the 90s and the 2000s like I was shouting into a void, because I really was. There was not a lot of there wasn't any there except for what I was doing and what Andy Zeisler at Bitch Magazine was doing. But now there's so much company. You're writing for The Atlantic, for example, but folks who haven't paid attention to that kind of critical sphere, I feel like your book is a real sort of clarion call, a wake-up call. And I'm wondering if that's part of if the nostalgia thing, how that sits with you, and what you think millennial women, what their experience was with all of this content.
I mean, I should say I absolutely understand the nostalgia. I mean, we made a playlist. My publisher, Penguin Press, asked me to pull a playlist that was made of all the songs that I think I mentioned in the book and the artists. And, I put it on, and it's like, it's so good. The music is so powerful. It really I hear Cisco's Thong Song, which is objectively quite a sexist song, but it just drags me back to high school. It's such a good song. I mean, good, I'll qualify my use of the word good, but it the way it sounds, it takes me back to a place in time, to a feeling, to dancing, to being exuberant, like joyful, young, yes, to being young. But I understand I understand the nostalgia, and my goal with the book was not to ruin anyone's fun. I really didn't want to kill anyone's favorite product or write off their favorite show, because sources of joy and pleasure and comfort in our lives are not as abundant as they should be. And so if watching The Bachelor makes you happy, do whatever makes you happy, you should do. It was more about trying to make connections, trying to establish patterns, trying to look really thoroughly at this era, at all the different forms of media that I could find, music, obviously TV, film, art, fashion, to sort of look really holistically and to try and make connections that would allow people to interpret things in their own mind and to draw their own conclusions, really. Like, I didn't want to be dictating to anyone what they should or shouldn't make of this era. There are some moments in the book where I think it's very clear how I feel, and that hopefully is enough. But with the nostalgia side of things, what seems to be really interesting to me is it's not a lot of it coming from millennials. It seems to be coming from Gen Z, who didn't really live through this era or were children in the 2000s, and they seem to appreciate more, I would say, the aesthetic of it, which I understand, because, you know, it's such a glorious visual decade. Like, it's so tacky, but it's so pink, and, you know, everything, like bedazzled cell phones and like pink velour juicy couture sweatsuits and, you know, tiny dresses that girls wear on the red carpet. It's so excess. It's so kind of glorious, kitschy style, and that, I think, seems to be what people are attaching to in their nostalgia of the era. Less the feel of it and the power dynamics of it than the aesthetic and the way that it looked. And so I guess my hope is, with a book like this, I can make space for people to enjoy it, but also to really clarify the patterns behind it and the agendas behind it in ways that help us identify those same patterns and agendas in our lives and in our media now.
So, speaking of agendas behind everything, I feel like one of the things that kept coming up for me when I was reading Girl on Girl is that you draw from so many different sources of knowledge and thought and criticism around all of these different aspects of media and culture. And so it feels almost like I was saying before, there's a bit of like a recap of 30 years, but it also feels like a lit review to some degree. Like a lit review of sort of popular feminist thought and anti-racist thought about these different genres and what they mean for women of color. But one thing that I didn't see like explicitly named in the book is exactly what you just alluded to, which is whose agenda, like where do you lay? I know what my answers are, but I'm curious what yours are of why all of this was happening. You don't specifically say like, and this was all capitalism. It was behind all of this, or there's not really a focus on right-wing organizing, but we know that there was a huge amount of right-wing organizing. Do you think that this was that all of these sort of conflicting and overlapping and deeply misogynist projects were the result of, is it, do you see like, I don't mean Nate, you know, give me a boogeyman right now. That's not what I'm asking, but I'm saying like, do you see this as ultimately a right-wing political backlash? Do you see it as the result of media and telecommunications consolidation and policy shifts? Do you see it as sort of more of the same capitalist misogyny we've always seen? Is it a combination of all of that? What is the agenda behind everything you've pieced together?
I think it's yes, and yes, it's everything. I mean, I sort of joked, I think, once at a reading that there was no kind of Illuminati, like there were no people meeting in rooms to like dictate the cultural agenda for the next 10 years. Like it was much more nebulous than that and much less organized, but it was cohesive at the same time, I think, because everyone was reacting to the conditions of the time. And those conditions included lots of different things, but like 9/11 was very influential on reality TV because afterwards people really craved distraction. And they really wanted shows that were sort of less serious, that would help them be distracted and be transported away from the much more obviously dark and heavy news cycle. But you mentioned Mike Darnell and Mike Fleiss. I think often what was happening at the time was happening because there were a handful of men who had outsized power, and whom no one was really questioning or checking, and they were allowed to do whatever they wanted, make the shows that they wanted, make the products that they wanted, set the agenda. And I don't know that it was like an organized thing. It was more like that was just their taste. That was just what they liked to do. Like, they didn't care that 50 women would line up like pageant style to compete for the affections of a wealthy man whom none of them had ever seen. Like, that didn't strike them as obscene in any way. That was just something that they thought would make good TV that people would watch. So over and over, I think it comes down to a handful of people who weren't really questioned. And in Hollywood, in movie making during the 2000s, in the book I mention a profile of the actor Anna Faris, which was written by Tad Friend in The New Yorker. I think it was 2011. And Tad Friend quotes someone in the Hollywood studio system who just says, let's face it, if producers don't want to make movies about women, they won't. And I think it's kind of breathtaking clarity in some ways, because that's exactly what was happening. Like, women just didn't interest producers at the time. They didn't see them as a demographic that would go to the movies. I mean, men picked the movies that people went to on dates. It was just, women just did not seem like interesting fodder in this moment until the movie Bridesmaids came out and was a certifiable smash. It was so popular and it made so much money that suddenly everyone shifted and rejiggered and reoriented around, actually, what if we tried to make movies that really did see women as people? Like, what would that look like? And I think it speaks so much to just the nature of how everything changes, and you don't always know how and why. There isn't always a singular reason, but often there is, and it's not the reason that you might expect, as I mentioned about 9/11 or even the AIDS crisis.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. It's interesting that the section on movies, in particular the section on Anna Faris and others, it did remind me of this cyclical nature.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just Bridesmaids, though. Even I don't remember the exact year, but Nia Vardalos, when she came out with her rom-com My Big Fat Greek Wedding, was an independent. She did it mostly independently, on a shoestring, and it was the Greek community in individual little movie theaters that sort of word of mouth made it huge.
Oh my gosh.
Gigantic moneymaker, just huge. And the reaction in Hollywood from studios was like, well, this has to be a fluke. This can't be, nobody's going to want a movie with a woman who is not like, traditionally Hollywood stick thin with big boobs and blonde and gorgeous. That's not, nobody's going to want to watch a movie where she's in control and she's the lead, even though they just had this proof that that is exactly what people wanted to watch. So Dallas, when she was trying to sell another movie, was continually shot down, even with the proof that the chick flick model does work. And so she ended up financing her own focus groups, and presented focus group data to studios saying, no, actually men will go to movies with their girlfriends or their sisters or whoever, if it has a female lead. And studios were like, we don't believe this data. And then Bridesmaid. So it's like the cyclical thing is that every few years there's one big movie like Bridesmaids, and then they'll say it's a huge fluke. Before it comes out, they'll say the press coverage will generally be, this movie has to do incredibly well. It has to break box office records, or there will not be any more movies with female leads. And then when it does do incredibly well, they say it's a fluke. And yet when Tom Cruise has a movie that fails, they don't say we're going to not do another shoot 'em up with Tom Cruise. They say we'll do 10 more and see how he does in some of them. Right?
No, I mean, it's so true. Every time a new male director has a hit, no one says no to him ever again. Like, it just becomes this thing of like, greenlight all his ideas, give him everything he wants, like yes, yes, yes. Whereas if a female director has a hit, I think people are much more skeptical. They're much more kind of, I don't know, they scrutinize her a lot more. They're like, maybe this is a fluke or a one-off. There's a lot less, there's a lot more hesitancy around the idea of like immediately jumping on board and giving her the same opportunities, for sure.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
And I think that a lot of what that is about is something that you allude to in the later part of the book, which is, ironically, you talk about it more in the chapter where you look at sort of the scam, what you call the scam of Me Too. No, sorry, not Me Too. God, the scam of the lean in, sort of corporatized, co-opted girl boss feminism that doesn't take on structural problems and doesn't and explicitly avoids looking at collective solutions to structural problems that affect all women in workplaces, but instead redirects and repackages a more sort of consumerish, commodified version of individualistic girl boss feminism. You talk a lot about that kind of the tension between what would create real change, which is the structural, versus what is a band-aid that will only help a few women succeed in a stacked deck, right? I think that also very much applies to Hollywood and to both the film and TV industry as well as the music industry. What gets created, I agree with you from what you said before, that there's no shady cabal. There's no, but I do believe that media consolidation, that ownership constricting into just a few hands, all of whom are very wealthy, very white, male, almost all are white, and pretty much all are male hands, owners. There are structural problems both in terms of representation that comes out of that and in terms of who gets to even be in the rooms that decide what gets greenlit, right? So that brings me to something else that I wanted to read, another quote of yours that I wanted to read, which is in the Girls on Top chapter toward the end of the book. And this is in the context of Me Too, I believe. Still, the accusations against men in the entertainment industry seemed particularly noteworthy to me, if only because these were the people defining the contours of our collective imagination. It was hard to watch heavyweight after heavyweight uncovered as an alleged predator without wondering how women had managed to make any creative headway in the industry at all. To me, and then in the months after Me Too, one of the ways of assessing how seriously the entertainment industry was taking the deluge of women's stories was by noting how many women it was willing to pay for the privilege of writing their own stories. And then you look at the year after Me Too sort of broke through, you look at all the TV shows that were greenlit, and you find that they're primarily just by men, for men, about men. So, okay, Me Too, but what are the stories? What were they investing in? Still the same, right? So I find it fascinating. I was really, really glad that you called out specifically the men in the industry who were uncovered as predators, because this is something that I've talked about a lot in my work over the years too, and I address I have a media literacy graphic novel coming out in the next year, and I address it in there too, that when all of our news media, where we get all of our information, and all of our pop cultural products, our art, are controlled by, produced by, written by, framed by, edited by men many of whom themselves have committed sexual harassment, committed rape, or have been white supremacist in discriminatory ways in their workplaces or in their personal lives, when they are the ones who set the frames for both news and art and culture, then it informs how we all collectively get to understand the world around us. So I thought it was a really interesting point that you brought into the Me Too chapter that I do not see a lot of other people talking about. And I wanted you to talk a little bit also about another thing that you talk about that I haven't seen discussed as broadly as it should, which is the connections between fashion, porn, torture porn, and 9/11. And I could go into it, but I feel like
Mm-hmm.
there are two full chapters on this. So I just want to do the chatty Cathy, wind you up and let you go, right?
Yeah, I think I was really interested in finding out where the very heavily sexualized era of porno chic in the 2000s came from, because I do remember everything just felt so pornified in Y2K really onwards. There was so much like really explicit sexuality in mainstream media. I think one of the things I use in the chapter 2 is there was a coffee table book and a gallery show of work by the photographer Terry Richardson in 2005. It was called Terry World. And it was a very like highbrow chic product. I mean, he had this big launch in New York, lots of celebrities went. But the book and the exhibition, they're mostly, I would say, pictures of his penis and pictures of the girls who he can cajole into interacting with his penis in one way or another. And I know, looking at it now, it's on Internet Archive if anyone wants to look at it, but looking at it now, it just seems so extraordinary to me that this was lauded as a work of highbrow art in so many ways. And I wanted to understand how that happened. So I went back to the 90s, and there really seemed to be this movement in fashion, especially, and in fashion photography, towards intentional provocation, towards transgression. And some of it, I think, was a reaction to the Reagan era and its cultural conservatism. It was people trying to kind of set a more interesting, creative, radical agenda. Part of it, I think, was responding to AIDS in a way that artists wanted to reclaim the idea of sex as a source of joy and pleasure and meaning in people's lives, not just as this sense of this source of fear and anxiety, as it had been treated in a lot of the media at the time. So there was this kind of like real uptick in sexualized imagery and transgression and provocation in the 90s, and a lot of it did come from fashion. And then in the 2000s, it just really curdled into something much darker, much more commercialized, much uglier. And then after the Iraq War, obviously pictures emerged from Abu Ghraib of really sadistic sexualized abuse of Iraqi prisoners by American soldiers. And what struck me looking at them was that they looked like Terry Richardson's photographs. They had the same men in like aviator glasses posing with a thumbs up next to someone who's being abused. It was this real, there was such a similarity in I think what the shift in how people had understood themselves as potential subjects of pornography, but also this idea that sex was not just about sex and pleasure anymore. It was about expressing a particular kind of dominance, a particular kind of male dominance and male power. And you see it over and over again, and you obviously see it in the Abu Ghraib photos, but you see it in, for instance, the Hostel movies of the time, the torture porn movies, which, by the way, were produced by The Bachelor's Mike Fleiss. I love when that comes out. Yep. But you just see this...
Had his own domestic violence charges against him.
Yeah, that too. You see just this idea of sex as a sort of affirmation of male power and male dominance. And then the thing that I found that really blew my mind was I found an American Apparel ad. And obviously American Apparel ads, we know, have been always like creepy and highly sexualized and feature very young looking girls. But this one had actually stacked models in a human pyramid to resemble the one that had been stacked at Abu Ghraib. So it was the same like dehumanization of people's bodies that is very much being played for a joke, like as a sort of ironic ha ha ha, but the same sense of power dynamics behind it. And you know, that's all these different mediums, obviously history, politics, the war, but also fashion and photography and the media and commercial advertising. It was all kind of doing the same thing in the era in a way that I found really rich and really interesting to dig into.
Yeah, the some of those specific details that you uncover, I think, will really shock people who either didn't see it at the time, or maybe they saw it but through a different lens, because it's often easier for people to look back at media. I mean, as a media critic, one of my pet peeves is always this thing of, oh, through today's eyes.
Yeah.
In the actual moment that it was happening, I was writing about it and shouting into a void.
Yeah.
I was talking about it on TV. I was talking about it on the radio. But I understand not everybody's a media critic, right? So it
Yeah.
really is easier a lot of times with hindsight to make more meaning, to build more connections. And I think a lot of those details, especially like that American Apparel ad, or like I was glad that you had a passing reference to the Anna Faris movie where there's a rape scene in it is played as a joke. I literally put that scene in as one of about 10 different rape scenes that elicit that play on the no means yes trope. In a media literacy workshop that I did, a keynote that I did at a lot of college campuses a few years back, where I showed that usually within less than a minute on screen, sometimes 15 seconds, whether it's movies or TV, there'll be a woman who is either physically fighting or saying no forcefully. And by the end of the scene, she's a very willing participant in own sexual predation. That's the no means yes trope. And I thought that it was so important that you had these moments in the book where you point those things out. I wanted to talk a little bit about, let me see how much time we have left. We've got 9 minutes left. Wow. Obviously I could talk to you all day about this. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about I don't remember which page I had written so many post-its. You mentioned that to your read, the two most important things that or significant things that changed the way millennial women live were the economic crisis in the 2000s and the rise of Instagram. And I find that really, really telling. And I agree with you that those two things were incredibly influential in terms of how millennial and even other generations before and after women lived. But I also wonder what you think about, there's one aspect of media, and you talk a lot on the internet about the internet in the book, and I hope we have time to talk about that too. But one aspect of the internet that you don't talk about that I think is that I was wondering why not is the feminist blogosphere specifically. Whether it was the Bitch Magazine's blog, whether it was Brittany Cooper and the other women at the Crunk Feminist Collective, whether it was our organization, Women in Media and News, had the first feminist group blog on the internet, whether it was Veronica Areola and bringing politics into the mom bloggers world, there were just so many different, Jill Filipovic, who went on to write for Glamour and then the New York Times, Samita Mukhopadhyay, who started at Feministing, who went on to become the editor of Teen Vogue. For about 10 to 15 years, the feminist blogosphere sort of created the space to bring a lot of the issues that you talked about in the book that were eventually bleeding into pop cultural spaces, Beyonce saying feminist on stage, which you discuss, that none of that would have happened without the feminist blogosphere, nor would all of the discussion of sort of toxic masculinity and incels and the male violence crisis as stoked by disinformation online. All of that was stuff really dug into for about 10 to 15 years. And I'm wondering, when you were going either through your research, but even more interesting to me is when you were living through that era and trying to make sense of all of it, were you engaging with feminist blogs? Were you engaging with independent feminist media? Because most of what you talk about is the corporate media side. And I'm really interested to know about the independent media side and the feminists who basically transformed how we think of feminism popularly.
No, I absolutely was. And they are in the book. They're in chapter 8, which is the chapter about female auteurs, the rise of the female auteur.
Right. Sure, the confessional side, yes. I was just wondering more of the political side.
No, I mean, I think the political side, it's obviously not given a huge amount of space in the book, and I think the reason for that is because it could just be a book all by itself, really. Like if I think there was so much, and the way I focused my thinking in writing was quite specific, because I was really trying to get certain themes across and certain ideas across. But no, I mean, I was a huge reader of these blogs, and I'm still a huge reader of all these women. And I think a point I make in the book is that when something like the Me Too movement happened, and you had women telling their stories and trusting that people would hear them and listen to them and take them seriously, that is not something that could have happened without this wave of women writing, like writing in first person often, but just writing on the internet. And it was really like significant to me, I think, that after so much of what I think, I mean, you will probably have experienced this early, but so much of my experience of these first person feminist blogs was really in the 2010s and the late, I would say, 2000s, 2008, 2009. And so much of it seemed to be a direct response to the ways that women were being treated in media in the 2000s, the ways in which they were being like dehumanized and torn apart and stalked by photographers and harassed and like belittled, made into jokes. Like just the really ugly treatment of women in 2000s media spawned its own backlash, which was, of course, this wave of incredible, powerful, diverse, like groundbreaking women's writing online. And it's so meaningful to me, and it was so meaningful to all of us. And as you said, it really did shape so much of what came after, so much of the shift towards more empathetic storytelling, and so much of, obviously, yes, the sort of trend in feminism in 2014, as I'm using that word ironically, but a lot of it did seem to come directly from this wave of writers who insisted that women were human, and women were intelligent, and women had ideas, and women had things to say, and women wanted change. So yeah, I think it was immensely important. And it is in the book. It doesn't quite, I'm sure, get the space that it deserves, but so much of this process of trying to pass this very broad sweep of history was just trying to find ways to focus it for myself.
For sure. I wish we could talk for a whole other hour. We have to wrap. I want to tell the viewers of this program that in addition to everything that Sophie and I have been talking about that she covered in the book, she also talks about, she links the glam of the Real Housewives and sort of the reality TV face to women in politics in the Republican Party today. Mm-hmm. She links, she talks about the rise of reality TV leading directly to the influencer age that we're in right now. She talks about the bait and switch of Kim Kardashian just trying to be your friend online, but really selling you appetite suppressant lollipops. There's so much in here. She talks about torture. She talks about porn a lot, not in an anti-porn way, but in a what is porn doing to us when it becomes more and more hardcore and mainstream at the same time. There's so many different things that you're going to get from this book. And Sophie, thank you for writing it, and thank you for talking with me today about it.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for this conversation. It was a real pleasure.
It was a pleasure for me too.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.